All right, so I want to talk about the wind ring method and the math that's involved in it. And and here's the thing about the wind ring method. I am 100% absolutely convinced that if you don't use the wind ring method, your success rate, it's not that you can't go out there and on any given day fire off some monster score, but the consistency of the game to be able to shoot rounds over and over again where you're always up there and you've got more consistency. The wind ring method is going to give you a way to be able to do that. But here's the thing is I know when the wind ring method first came out and it was very early on in the game, take somebody like Tommy. Tommy shot a video of the guy that figured out the wind ring method, but at that time, Tommy was like, I do it a different way. And a lot of what he did was it was spot stuff. So he tried to end up in the same spot over and over and over again. And then when he was in that spot, then he would be like 1.5 rings off or 2 rings off of a transitional surface, or he had a spot that he picked. And so he was very spot oriented. But you look at his play now, it's everybody who does is really successful at this game uses the wind ring method. But there's a lot of different numbers that are going around out there. So let's just take for instance, this is the old style. So if you have a 0 accuracy, you've got it counts as 3 per ring. And if you've got 100% accurate, it counts as 1 per ring. So if you're at 50, it's 2, and then it's got the scale that goes down. And so this chart right here shows you what your accuracy is, whether if it's 35, then you're going to be at 3.3 per ring, or excuse me, 2.3 per ring. If it's 40, you're going to be at 2.2. If it's 45, you're going to be at 2.1. That's per ring. And then if you count all 5 rings, if you're at 50 accuracy, it's 2 per ring, but it's 10 for the entire ring set. So that'll give you an idea, especially if you're playing up in Tour 8 or Tour 9 or Tour 10 or in the upper tours where you've got a 15-mile-an-hour wind, you may have to move more than one ring set. You may have to move and then reset. There was a video just recently, Tommy put out a video here like in the last month, and he was talking about when you're looking at your ring set, and it almost is like this right here where you have that dot in the middle. And so the dot in the middle takes up some space. So if you're drawing from here and drawing over to this line right here, the dot is actually adding on like it's like adding on like 0.02. And so so the deal is when you're making your adjustment, for any of you that watched that video that Time put out, when you're making your adjustment, you either pull from here to the line and then reset and then pull back to the line so that you're not encountering the 0.2, or you always pull past the line so that it's always in the equation, but you have to recognize that it's there. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this stuff, but just counting the ring. So if we're 1 ring here, if this is an extra mile, and let's put in for a maxed out extra mile just so that we have, I think most people are going to be, hold on, like in the level 7, 2.1, 2.2 per ring, right in that level right there. Even though there's no accuracy difference here, I don't think between 7 and 8, it does get a little more accurate. So that means if you're using your extra mile, and this is a very, very popular club, every ring's 2.1 miles per hour. So that means that it's somewhere in the 45 accuracy, maybe 44, maybe 47, but it's somewhere around 45 accurate because it's right there at 2.1 per ring. So if it was 50 accurate, it would be 2.0 per ring, right? See how that works? So think about this. You're taking a shot, and here's where you're setting up, and then down here is where you're trying to hit. And here's the line that you're trying to be on. And you hit a 1 ring great. A 1 ring great on an extra mile is 2.1 miles per hour. So that means that your fluctuation you could be on your line is going to be bigger than if you had a quarterback, which is 100% accurate. So the rings are 1 per ring. So that means 2 rings on a quarterback will fit into 1 ring on an extra mile. So that's why on a lot of holes, like you can bring out a extra mile and take the shot, but you're better off bringing out a QB because it's not about the raw distance going out there. You're trying to lay it up into a spot. and trying to weave it in there, you're much better off, because if you catch a 1-ring grade or even a 2-ring grade on a quarterback, that's like hitting a 1-ring grade on an extra mile. So you have much more room for error when you're using that more accurate club, because it's a more accurate club. Now, figuring out the math. I don't know how Golf Clash Notebook and Golf Clash Caddy do their math. And really the math that we're looking for is, we've got a max number, we've got a mid number, and we have a min number. And so I don't know how they arrive at their mid max. I don't know what their equation is. And they also make adjustments for what kind of ball you have. So if you have a power 1 or a power 2, 3, 4, 5, 0 power ball, then the numbers here are going to change based off of what ball you have. So it's 2.1, it's 1.9 if you're using a power 5 ball, 1.9 if you're using a power 4, it's 2.0 if you're using a power 3 ball, 2.0 if you're using a power 2. Then it goes, so for 0 and 1 ball, it's the same. So they make adjustments for that. I don't know how they arrived at those numbers. I don't know what part in the equation that they did it, or what part of their algorithm adjusts for that. In my game, I don't make any allowance for extra ball if I'm using a bigger ball, or I don't make any allowance for the ball at all. What I do is that I will make slight elevation adjustments where I'll add on or take off wind. And sometimes I may have to add on or take off wind on one of my shots. So if you're using Golf Clash Notebook and you're watching me and I'm using the same club as you and we're both at max and they've got the same numbers, but I'm using an elevation, I may have to use an elevation because I'm trying to make up for the ball. Whereas if you're using Golf Clash Notebook, it's allowing for the ball and it's making those adjustments. Where we really go off and where like the community as a whole is on this max, mid, min. So I use this old school anarchist, the very first video that Tommy shot where he had the guy shot a video. I can't remember what his name was. He shot a video and then Tommy found out about it. And then Tommy contacted him. And then Tommy highlighted the video on his channel where he talked a little bit and then played the video that the kid who figured out the wind ring method played that video. And in the background on the wall, there was a piece of paper and I froze it right at that point and I've got a little teeny handheld telescope, and I took out my little handheld telescope and I blew it up until the pixels were as clear as they could be, as big as it could be. And I used my little handheld telescope and he had some numbers written on the wall on this piece of paper. And I've used these numbers since I started playing. So I started playing like the week before the Sakura Hills tournament came out, which is like the second tournament that we played. And I didn't have enough coins in my odd account to actually play in the tournament. So I think the first tournament I played in was the third tournament. And I think that was the 4th of July tournament in 2017. And my 77 account, I started my 77 account right after my auto account, but I didn't start playing in tournaments in it until the UK Championships, which was the 4th tournament. And at that time, I already had these numbers because I recognized real early if I couldn't figure out some way to scientifically or a repeatable way of addressing the wind, that I wasn't going to play. It had to be something that I had to be able to figure out, or because I wasn't going to just play a game and eyeball it every time. I couldn't do that. So here's how I work my mid, max, my minimum, mid, and max numbers on short irons. I've got max is 1, mid is 1.75, and min is 2.0. What's up, Buster Boy? All right, and what that means is let's say you had an upper hornet that's probably like level 7, level 8, I think maybe even around level 6. Let's look at where the hornet gets its stuff. I think it's somewhere around level 6. Let's go into hornet. This hornet's a great example. That's a great short iron. Maybe if I can get it to quit bouncing around. Wind chart. So somewhere around this level right here, level 6, level 5, level 6. So when it gets to level 6, these are the numbers. So it's 1.1. And now let's see what they've got for mid. They've got 1.5. and their minimum is 2.2. So 1.1, 1.5, 2.2. So they've got it at 1.1, 1.5, and 2.2. So you could do the reverse math to see how they figured that out. So it'd be so this is how you do the equation. It'd be 1.1 times x equals 1.5. So then you would divide both sides by 1.1. So you divide 1.5 by 1.1, and that would tell you what percentage they're upgrading on x, what that variable is. So once you get that number, you could go back in here, and 1.1 times that number equals 1.5, right? So on mine, in this scenario, with a club that is 1.1 at max, when my Hornet was at level 6, 7, and 8, my math was this. It was 1.1, 1.9, 2.2. And that's what I hit my club at. So the difference here was in this mid number. And so I had people for years telling me, because I shot my Hornet at these numbers forever. And people going, hey, dude, you did a 1.9. It's supposed to be. And if you're using the app, they're going to tell you 1.5. Okay, but I've made enough shots with my Hornet in mid club at 1.9 that there's no way I'm moving off that number. I feel confident in these numbers. The question that we always have here is, how in the hell can everybody have different numbers and we still have great results? If you're a fan of Shakespeare in Love, that movie, it's a mystery. It'll all work out. How will it work out? It's a mystery. We are all going to have different numbers. So like if you're watching my video and on how I factor numbers, this is how I factor my numbers. So on short iron, it is the 1.1, 1.75, and 2.0. That means that my short iron is 75% more accurate at mid club is how I count it. So I take the 1.1 times 1.75, means it's 75% more accurate, and that's how I arrived at the 1.9. It's twice as accurate at minimum club. So I take the min number, which is 1.1, and I times it by 2, and that's how I arrived at 2.2. So I do short irons in that number, and I do long irons at 1, 1.5, 1.75. So my long iron is 50% more accurate when it's at mid club and 75% more accurate when it's at max club. So I currently am using a Grizzly, and my Grizzly is 100% accurate. So its base number is 1. So that's a Grizzly. It's 100% accurate. Okay? And I spelled that wrong. Grizzly. What kind of spelling you got here? So it's a 1 per. So I hit it exactly like the numbers there. It's 50% more accurate when it's at mid club, and it's 75% more accurate when it's at minimum. So these are the numbers that I use on my Grizzly because it's a 100% accurate club. So if it was a 2 accuracy club here, it'd be 2, and then it would be 1.5 times 2. So it would be 3 would be its midline, and then it'd be 1.75 times 2 would be its max. So what does that work out to? 1.75 times 2. My brain's not working. 1.75 times 2 would be 3.5 would be my max number. So that's how I arrive. So 3.5 would be my max number. So that's how I arrive at those numbers. So let me do those on a clean screen here. So short iron, it's 1, 1.75, 2.0, twice as accurate. Long iron, it's 1, it's 1.5, it's 1.75. Wood, it's 1, it's 1.25, 1.5. So that when I'm saying that I'm playing with my sniper and when it's at max club, I'm playing at 1.5 per ring, that's how I'm arriving at that number, because I count it as 50% more accurate at mid club and 25% more accurate when it's in mid club. So when I say I'm playing my mid club and I'm playing 1.2, now that I'm using a calculator, I actually do the 1.25. But that's how I'm playing that. Wood or drivers. Drivers, I'm playing at 1, 1.125, 1.25. So it's 25% more accurate when it's in minimum club, and it's 12.5% more accurate when it's in mid club. And that's how I arrive at my numbers, because that's the math that I use, because I'm using a pen and paper and a calculator. And so I have to have, and so when I've got my cheat sheet for my clubs, I've got a cheat sheet for my 77 account, which is 77 and not because they have pretty much the same clubs. It's my practice account and my main. And then I have 99, which is a lower level account, and I don't play those clubs all the time. And I'm still developing clubs. And so I wrote those numbers down because I don't use my Kingfisher all the time, my main account. So I wrote down what my numbers were for my Kingfisher for my max. And how did I arrive at the max? I used the chart. This chart right here is what I use to establish my max. So if it's 10%, if you got 10% accurate, it's 2.8, 0, 3. And I just work up the scale. And so that's how I establish my base number for my maximum club. And then I use that math that I just showed as far as this math right here to arrive at my mid and max numbers. Now, I don't normally, unless it's on a specific tournament hole, I usually don't even worry about the driver minimum or mid. Pretty much whatever my max driver is. I very seldom ever, there are a couple tournament holes where there's par threes that we use a driver and we're at minimum club, and I will go through and work the math on that. But normally I don't care about any number on drivers other than the max club. Because if I'm in my extra mile and I'm pulling it back and I'm not using, like, if you're adjusting it just a little bit back from the red line, but if you're at the red line with a tailwind, typically with your extra mile, you're all the way at the red line. And if you're not all the way at the red line and you pulled it way back, why aren't you using a more accurate club like a quarterback or a rock? Because if you're not needing the distance, why aren't you bringing out a more accurate club? So I very seldom ever worry about my drivers mid or max. My wood, this is where it starts to be important to have these numbers written down, because you will find yourself in some occasions where you're at max wood, especially if you're using a long iron. If you're using a Goliath, you'll find less times where you're in your minimum wood because your Goliath is taking up some of that spot. But if you're using a club like a Grizzly or a Saturn, which is, like in the 125 or somewhere in that neighborhood, you may end up doing some shots where you're at minimum club with your wood. So this is kind of where it's important to start remembering the numbers. But long iron and short iron, these are key spots, especially short iron. And you have to have ultimate faith in these short iron shots, because if you watch my videos on a regular basis, I'm all about trying to get into short iron range, especially if you can get into mid or minimum short iron, because in my mind, my short iron is 75% more accurate at mid club, and it's 100% more accurate. It's twice as accurate when it's at minimum club. So I am keen on trying to dig my way into my short iron range, because I believe that club's super accurate when you get down into the mid and the minimum numbers. So I'm always trying to get down into those numbers. But I can tell you that my numbers are different. I have teammates that I talk to all the time that they use the Golf Clash notebook numbers, and so our numbers are always going to be a little different. That's why on some holes I have to do an elevation and you don't, or there's holes that you're doing an elevation and you're like, hey dude, I'm doing a 10% elevation, and I'm like, I ain't doing that elevation and I'm having success, because my base numbers are different than your base numbers. But I can assure you that in the community as a whole, for people who use the WinRing method, everybody's got different clubs. They're all at different accuracies. We're using different balls. Our landing zones are varying. And so the deal is that you have to have faith in the numbers that you've picked, and you have to go with those numbers. And then we have to make slight adjustments. Sometimes I will start off on a cup where I'll start off on this edge, because in order for me to get in the hole, I have to start off on this edge, where in your shot, you need to be right at the flagpole. And so we have this variance, and that variance can be in how we're arriving at our numbers. So like basic math when you're doing this stuff. So let's take, for instance, that we had a 50% accurate club and it's 2 per ring. Just like basic math. Okay. It's 50% accurate. We're doing 2 per ring. Okay. So let's say this was 2 per ring, and we had a 4 mile an hour wind. So what we're going to do here on our calculator. So I've got my phone set up normally next to me. I'm playing on my tablet, and then I've got my phone set up next to me. My phone is sitting on my calculator. And so I know going into the hole that I'm going to do a 10% wind adjustment. So I'm going to add 10% onto the wind. So I'm going to do 1.1. Okay, that's 100%. And then I'm going to add on 10%. So it's 1.1 times. And so I'm sitting here before I get to the hole, and I've already got that in my calculator. I know that whatever the wind is, I'm going to take 1.1, I'm going to add on 10% to the wind. So if I had a 3 mile an hour wind and I added on 10%, just doing the math in my head, that'd be 3.3. So we take 1.1 times 3, and that equals 3.3. And then we get an equal. So that's how much the wind really is. That's what we're really counting for the wind. Okay, so you've got a number. Now here's what really helps. You can then, in your brain, take the 3.3, and let's say you have a club that is 100% accurate, and it's 1 per ring. Well, that's easy math. You just move it 3.3 rings. That's super easy. But let's say your club is 1.7. Okay, that's still pretty easy because 2 times 1.7 is 3.4. So that means it's just slightly less than 2 rings. Right? So you can do that math in your head. Or if you're using a calculator, you can take this one step further. And the one step further that you can take is you can take the 3.3, and let's say you were using a club that was 1.7 per ring. You would then divide that number by 1.7, and this gives you a ring value. So it's 3.3 miles per hour of wind divided by 1.7 miles per hour per ring. And that means I need to move that club 1.94 rings. Now, it's usually very difficult. I mean, let's get real here. It's usually very difficult to get this. I mean, when you're looking at your ring set, the 1.9, so remember that 1.94 here. Let me switch to a different screen. Let's go back to this screen. I'll put it up. So if you're doing 1.94 as your wind ring, and you've got, so here's 2, like, are you rounding it up to 2, or are you rounding it down to 1.9? So like looking at this right here, like establishing if we put 10 tick marks in here for, trying to get an in-between on a tick, and we don't have tick marks when we're out on the field. So there's always going to be a little bit of variance. So I don't normally worry too much about this. I tend to round up more than I round down. So if it was 2.4, I'm going to try and be a little past the 1.9, but where the hell's the 1.9? If it was 1.99, I'm just going to do 2. If it was 1.98, I'm going to focus on 2. I'm not going to focus on trying to get some variable. If I'm in the middle, I'm gonna attempt to do it, but this 10th number that's down here is always hard to adjust for. So you need to either round up or round down, and I tend to round up more than I do rounding down. So once again, our equation when we're doing the wind is, let's say we're doing a 50% wind adjustment. Okay. If we were doing a 50% wind adjustment, our equation would look like this. It's 1.5. I've got this set up before I even get to the hole. I know on that hole. So on hole number 8 in this last tournament, I went to my one-on-one setup. I wasn't trying any tournament stuff. I just went to how I play that hole when I'm playing one-on-one. And what I've established in one-on-one, if I'm going down to the green and trying to backspin, sidespin it to the hole, I need to do a 50% wind adjustment for the way that I calculate math. So I had 1.5 in there, and then the wind was like 4.7. So that means that I've got a 7.05 is what the wind actually is. Now my club hits 1.8. So just really quickly off the top of your head, divide 7.05 by 1.8. Yeah, it takes a second. You got to wrap your brain around. It's 3 rings is 6 less than 6. And I mean, just trying to wrap your brain around trying to do the math. So what I do is I immediately go 1.5, 50% wind adjustment, times the 4.7 wind, divided by 1.8. And this gives me a ring value. So I know that I'm going to move the club 3.91 rings or 3.92. So slightly over 3.9 rings. less than 4. And that gives me a ring number so that I don't have to do any math in my brain. It's 1.5 times 4.7 wind divided by 1.8 per ring, and I need to move that club 3.91 rings. And so that helps out, so you're not having to do. Now, sometimes, like on drives, I don't normally use the calculator on drives, because normally on drives it's a 10 or a 20%. And so if you've got a 4.7 and it's 10%, that's 0.47. And so a lot of times I can do that math in my head, and I'm not as particular on the drive. The money shot going into the cup is where you absolutely got to kill it. I mean, you want to be right there on it. Hold on. So that's how you do this math. So this is a basic algebra equation. And what's important here when you're talking to people is when people are telling you shots, you want to know what's important here is if you're doing the 50%, this is a 50% wind adjustment. And this is the wind times the wind divided by your rings, whatever number you're using for your rings. So when somebody shows you a shot and they go, yeah, man, I was doing a 40% wind adjustment. Okay, that tells me how to arrive at how high my wind should be. So I can take 40% times the wind of 4.7, and it tells me what my wind is. But what that doesn't tell me is how many rings I should pull, because I have no idea what you're using for your ring number. So are you in mid club, max club, minimum club? What ring number are you using? Because if you don't know that number and you use whatever number that you normally use for that, and it's not the same number that they were using, then you're going to get a varying result. So everybody out there is using something different. And so if you pick up a shot from somebody and you're practicing it, you've got to have all these numbers. You need to know what rings, how many rings they're pulling, and not just the elevation. Just getting an elevation doesn't help you. Knowing how many rings they're pulling at mid or max or whatever number they're using. And that number may not work for you. It may not work for you because you're in a slightly different spot or you're in the thing. So you have to adjust, this for me is usually pretty solid. I know what the deal is, and I may make adjustments on where I set it up. So if the cup's here and the flag's here, I may set it up on the outside, or I may set it up here, or I may go right at it. And I may make slight adjustments down here by feel, just based on how the ball is responding. But this is how you get to the math. And I know I've seen a lot of questions about how the math is. And just remember that everybody out there in the community who uses the WinRing method, if you're using one of the apps, they're going to give you numbers. And I don't know how they arrived at those numbers, but I know lots of people use them. And so, you can have success using them. It's not that you can't. I'm just used to using these numbers because I have faith in these numbers. I have confidence in them. So I know that I may have to work with my elevation adjustments, but as far as the WinRing, the numbers, if you stick with your numbers and keep your numbers solid, you can adjust that stuff out through elevation. So you can make adjustments so that you can get the same results as other people. Hopefully that kind of cleared up the math a little bit, but there is some math that's involved. It's one of the things I love about this game is that it does I use math every day in my work. And so just using these algebraic equations is not something that I do this every day. So hopefully that kind of cleared it up and showed everybody a little bit about how you arrive at the numbers. All right. Thanks for watching.